Okay, 10th edition is coming, and it's coming soon. We need to get hyped. Are you hyped? I'm hyped. Get so hyped. My community thinks it's going to be great. Here's a poll that I did, so it's over there. So in this video, I'm looking into why it's going to be great. Here are 10 great things you have to look forward to in 10th edition. No time for introductions, I'm just going to get straight in. First of all, streamlined rules. The rules for the 10th edition of 40k should be far more streamlined to make the game more accessible and reduce the barrier to entry for any new players. It's the sort of thing you think about where if I stop playing for 4 months, can I pick it up again? And it needs to stay that way throughout the entire edition. There's expected to be far fewer places you have to go to look up the actual rules. So in 9th edition there was a rule about reserves where they couldn't be set up in the first battle round, but this was not on the rules for reserves, it wasn't in the rules about deep strike that go on a unit's profile, and it wasn't in the army rules, it was actually in the match player mission rules. So it was in this really obscure place that you weren't expecting it to be, but you had to know it. So if you struggle to remember rules, you should be able to find rules easily, either in the Universal Special Rules section of the 10th edition rulebook, or on your 2-page army rules, or on the card of the unit that you're using. There shouldn't be rules anywhere else. You've got all the rules right there together, and you're not carrying around 1,000 books. That was always a problem, especially at tournaments where they have to have you bring all of your relevant books and documents, and you're just having a bag or a case just to carry the rule books. So everyone will save on back pay, which is great. Brings us to the next point. One rule in, one rule out. As expansions and seasons are introduced, because remember, this is looking to be very like Age of Sigmar, where they do seasons every 3 to 6 months, we will get rid of the problem of rule stacking. That happened a lot in 9th edition. So the Space Marines would get an FAQ, then the supplement books that modified the army rules by adding more rules, then there was balance patches which introduced new rules like Armour of Contempt that was around for a while, then previous FAQs were added into the main army rules when they got a second new codex. That was things like Bolter Discipline, so moved where it was as a rule, so it's an FAQ, now it's in your army rules, and it was a whole extra thing that was added. This is generally called rules bloat, and I've talked about this before in more detail. Games Workshop seems to be still trying to do their live service patches, even though they're a miniature game with a fixed rulebook and not something like Fortnite that can be easily updated as it's an online game. But if they're making changes every 3 to 6 months, then the rules will be one in, one out. It's much easier to remember your rules, and you're not getting stacks of rules, which really stop new players from entering the game later on in the edition because they haven't had time to learn all of the 10 previous rules that were stacked one on top of another over the years. So this will just be far better for a level of entry. Free rules to start with. Oh, I do love free rules. All of the rules for the armies, the main rulebook will all be free at the start of the edition, and all of your units, all of their special rules and profiles, that is free along with the points. All of it. It seems so obvious that this is necessary, but Games Workshop haven't done it until the recent past. It means we don't have to rely on things like Battlescribe and Warpedia just to play the game. These starting rules could potentially see you through the end of the edition. If it's going by the one rule in, one rule out, maybe we get to choose if we replace the rule or not. The 8th edition indexes, when the 7th edition had all of its codexes and main rulebooks released, those indexes cost money. And although you got like 3 armies in one, unless you played all of those armies, it wasn't particularly worth the purchase. And then very slowly the codexes were released. I haven't actually bought a codex since 2015, other than the Battle Sisters codex for 8th edition because I have nostalgia for Battle Sisters, and I wasn't in time to buy their 2nd edition codex before it went out of print. After all, it only had a lifespan of about 2 months. I'm not bitter. I've been playing since 2nd edition, but I didn't get that codex. Maybe I shouldn't admit to not having bought a codex since 2015. Because after all, you could just borrow friends for a bit, write down the rules, then you've got your own cheat sheet which you needed anyway in the previous editions just to keep going. And with all of the rules free online by various means, it kept poor people in the game without having to pay £20 just to use an army. I don't know actually how much codexes cost. I've never bothered to look. The new data cards for all of your units can be bought from the shops, but they're going to be free online, so you can just go there and print them out. Theoretically, if we're going by a one in, one out rule, and that stands, then you could use potentially the starter rules instead of newly released codexes. If, say, you thought the rule was better, or you didn't want to have to buy the new codexes. I wonder how tournaments would cope with that. Would they enforce that you have to use the most recent version, or would you get a choice? But you have, for free, a functional set of rules that could see you through the entire edition, as long as there's no major changes made. 10th edition is designed to have much greater balance, so no single army or strategy should be dominating the game for very long. That's how it's going to be, at least at the start. With these new indexes, we'll call them indexes, it's free rules that are online. They should be all balanced against each other because they're all being done at the same time, so we're not getting any kind of power creep, at least not immediately. So there should be very few strange outliers across the armies. Also, in 9th edition, there was a much greater focus on balance and the metrics for balance. They do streams where they explain if they're going to make changes to units or points. This is how it's going to be done, and this is why. Here's the armies that are winning lots of tournaments. Here's the problems that we're seeing, or the units that are being taken a lot. And they make modifications to those particular units without smashing down on entire armies, usually. This has been a very good approach, other than adding in whole new rules that entire armies get access to, like Armour of Contempt. Armour of Contempt was a rule that pretty much any army wearing power armor got, and it let you ignore 1 point of armor penetration. And it was a whole other rule that you had to remember for your armies, and also more likely your opponent's armies. Those power armored Space Marines are a very popular army. Doing the maths of, oh yeah, it's -3, wait, is that -3 after the extra +1, or is it without that? And it led to so much confusion on the battlefield. More often, they do these balance patches, it can be something as simple as tweaking the points that the secondary objective is worth. If you don't play by the match play rules and use those secondary objectives, then it doesn't particularly affect you, but it is going to balance out tournaments, so it doesn't affect the casual games. Thankfully, they have been going much more on small tweaks and changes rather than army sweeping changes in these balance updates. Armour of Contempt was generally seen by Games Workshop as necessary at the time to counter the amount of armor penetration that even the basic weapons of the forces had, but it was a mistake overall because the game should never have got that unbalanced to warrant its introduction. So balance will definitely be at the front of their mind, and it is the thing that the community complains about so much. And they want people to enjoy the game, otherwise they won't buy their very expensive models. Expensive is relative. Free rules, expensive models. We're going to see the introduction of reactions. This is something that already exists in Horus Heresy, and it seems to work quite well there. We've also seen some reactions anyway in 40k, things like Overwatch as a stratagem, where you interrupt someone's charge to shoot at them, but not as effectively, and stratagems like the Auspex scanner for Space Marines, which means you can interrupt a unit that deploys from reserve and shoot it. Reactions will keep the game moving. You're always actively thinking, you're not just watching and waiting. Far too often I've had my opponents suddenly check their messages on their phone, or say, oh yeah, that thing I was going to show you, I'll look it up now while it's your movement phase and there's nothing for me to do. Or maybe they go for a smoke break. Reactions will also open the game quite a lot. We've seen this new deep strike rule, that you can do a deep strike in the enemy turn, so I'm thinking for my Genestealer cult, I can exploit positioning more if a unit moves off an objective, as more recently Space Marines have had this rule where if they hold an objective in their turn, they can keep it for the rest of the game. Well, it's just an exposed objective. So I've been putting units on there. What are the other things we can do with that? You could deploy a unit out of line of sight in the enemy's turn, and then when it's your turn, you still get a movement phase, so you can jump around the cover and then charge them with a much shorter charge distance. The enemy's already moved, so they're out of position. That's something you could exploit very nicely. Or maybe you have a unit of Space Marine scouts on an objective and they're about to get nommed by some Tyrannic warriors. Well, teleporter time, here comes the Terminators, they're in the way now. Maybe you can combine that with an Overwatch, and then they're like, yeah, machine gun noises, yeah. What other things do you think you could do with that? It really keeps the mind going. I mean, we're thinking about it already. Tell me in the comments, what would you do with it? Have I covered all of the options? What are your models going to do? Oh yeah, the models. We're going to see a lot of new models, and not just, oh, here's a new thing, but better miniatures. The miniatures for 10th edition have been designed to be a higher standard and bigger, with more detail and improved quality. These are not the Failcast miniatures, if you remember back to 2012, 2013. One of my friends got really hyped for the idea of resin models. and then they got this Necron model, and it was just all bubble holes because the resin stuff they had was awful. A lot of the Tyranid models are from that time, so being able to see much better plastic versions is going to be great. As the models are bigger, especially these new Terminators, I've done a whole separate video on them, they're going to be easier to paint because they're larger, and it's a lot more plastic crack for your addiction. I mean, you get a lot more model for your money. Okay, back on track. I'll stop talking about the miniatures now. Back on balance. So, if all weapons are going to be balanced, then you'll have a lot more freedom with what you choose to put on your actual models. So, in theory, all weapon options are going to be of equal points value, because if they do something like Age of Sigmar, and much like many armies have with the current Arcs of Omen detachment rules, it's 1 points value per model, regardless of the weapon they have. And one weapon shouldn't be better than another, except at doing very specific things. So it doesn't matter if you have melter guns or flamers, neither one will be better than the other, they'll just have more dedicated roles. We've seen the introduction of the anti-rule, which looks like an auto wound on a specific roll if you hit the right thing that they're actually meant to hit. So a chain fist is anti-vehicle, so regardless of toughness, it wounds on a 3 against vehicles. 2 additions, melter guns have just been far and above the best weapon option to take. We might see a resurgence in balance, and then we can finally have a glorious time for the Battle Sisters, where flamers, bolt weapons, and melter guns all get equal value. We can dream, we can hope, we can get hype. It's not all about rules mechanics. We're talking lore. We're getting more lore and stories and ever-expanding narratives. So this is coming more from the West, that there is a 4th Tyrannic war, even though the 3rd one hasn't actually finished. And it's not just Chaos, it's not just Necrons, even though we're going to get more on what's happening over with Chaos and with Necrons. Now, it's been a while since we checked in with Baal. It's still there? Yep, that's great. Lionel Johnson is another returned Primarch, and we may get more information on what happened with the Dark Angels and how the anti-hero Cypher is doing. Games Workshop has learned, and the lesson has stuck. That's the important thing. Between 2003, when they released the Eye of Terror supplement book, and 2018, when 8th edition was launched, between that, those 15 years was no plot development whatsoever. And it was boring. It was just, oh yeah, we'll go even further back in time. No. Going forward is more interesting. So we get great new lore. Wonder what the Tyranids are doing, and now we have good explanations as to why there's new types of Space Marine and new Tyranid creatures, and it feels like a progression. When they released the Centurion Space Marines, it was just like, oh, so have these always been around, or when did they come in? If I'm setting something into year 600 of M41, are they meant to be there? Are they not? What are we doing? We're just playing a game. Better to have an expanding narrative. Games Workshop has learned from this, and it's good. I mean, it's great, because this is 10 great things about 10th edition. So even if you don't play the game, even if you're not very interested in the models, there's a lot more lore coming. And thinking of lore, your personal lore. Crusade! That's the whole thing that was introduced in the last edition, where you could have a Crusade army that changed and developed and got battle scars and injuries and wounds and special abilities. A lot more things to remember, but it was a lot of fun. I had a Battle Sister Crusade army. I've had them a while. These women have seen things. And that can roll over into the next edition without starting again. So the narrative journey of your own models can continue. To me, that is what 40k is entirely about. Tell me what your Crusade army's been doing. My sisters have been in a siege against Death Guard. They had to do a planet strike against rogue Battle Sisters who returned to Slanesh. That was some scarring times. Oh yeah, no one's going to sleep well after that. And that's reflected in the gameplay. Narrative Crusades. Great, and they're continuing. The final thing, the 10th thing, the thing I've left for last for no particular reason. Dedicated player community. You now have a VTuber who plays 40k to guide you through it all. Everyone is learning alongside you, so you won't feel that people know loads more than you just because they've been doing longer. I mean, it helps me. I've been going since 2nd edition. I know all the ins and outs of all these kinds of things. And I'm here for you. Thank you for listening to me. And if you subscribe, it makes it a lot easier for me to speak to you again. Have a great day of 40k. Great day. Did I mention I've been playing since 2nd edition? I don't know if I mentioned I've been playing since 2nd edition.